Hello and welcome back. Today I will be showing you a game between Yakov Estrin and Hans Berliner. But first, I also must show you that we have a special guest. Her name is Darling and she's a cute little duck. Anyways, so this game was played in the 5th Correspondence World Championship from 1965 to 1968. And the opening of this game was a Two Knights Defence Berliner variation. Okay, so now this is the game. White puts the pawn onto e4, which controls the center. Black mirrors white by pushing his pawn to e5. White develops his knight to f3 and attacks the pawn on e5. Black develops his knight to c6 and defends his pawn. White develops his bishop to c4, and black develops his knight to f6. And this move is now the Two Knights Defence. White puts his knight onto g5, where it threatens to take on f7, which forks the black queen and the black rook. And this is a very controversial move. Well, White attacks the f7 pawn, which black has left rather open. However, black will argue that white's loss of time will tell against him. And then after this, black pushes the pawn to d5 to stop white from taking the pawn on f7 with the knight. White takes the pawn on d5 with his own pawn. Then after that, black pushes his pawn to b5, which counterattacks the white bishop on c4. White retreats the bishop back to f1, black to its starting square. Black gets his knight out of danger and puts it onto d4, and he's also defending the pawn on b5. And then after this, white pushes his pawn to c3 to attack the black knight on d4. Black takes the white pawn on d5, which counterattacks the white knight on g5. And then after this, white retreats his knight back to e4 out of danger. Then black plays a good move, queen to h4. And this move characterizes the Berliner variation. The alternative is knight to e6. And knight to e6, and after knight to e6, white would play bishop takes b5, then black would play bishop to d7, then white would play bishop takes the bishop on d7, then black would take black would recapture the bishop on d7 with the queen, and then white would castle, and that denies black sufficient compensation. And that game is Boris Spassky versus Shamkovic. And that game was played in the USSR Championship, Leningrad, 1960. Okay, so anyway, back to the game. After that, white retreats his knight and gets his knight out of danger back to g3. And then after knight g3, black develops his bishop to g4 to attack the white queen. And to defend against the attack on the white queen, the white blocks the attack with the pawn on f3. But then black plays a good move, pawn to e4. And then white takes the black knight with his pawn. And then after that, black develops his other bishop to d6, where it puts pressure on the white knight that is on g3. Then after bishop to d6, white plays bishop takes the pawn on b5 with check. And to get out of the check, black moves the king to d8. So now black cannot castle. Except, he still is threatening bishop takes g3. And then after, white castles. And then Black takes the pawn on f3 with his own pawn. And then after that, white takes back with the rook. Then after rook takes f3, black moves his rook to b8 to attack the white bishop. And then white retreats the bishop to e2 but makes a mistake. And with this move, white starts to go seriously downhill. And after that, black takes the rook with his bishop. And then after black takes the rook, white took back with his bishop. And after bishop takes f3, black took the free pawn on d4 with his queen, and that is a check to the white king. Then white moves his king into the corner onto h1 to escape the check. And then black plays a good move. Bishop takes the knight on g3. And then after that, white takes back with his h-pawn. And then after h takes g3, black plays another good move. Rook to b6. And then after rook to b6, white moves his pawn to d3. And opens up his dark squared bishop. Then black moves his knight to e3 after that. Then white takes the black knight with his bishop. Black takes the white bishop back with his queen. Then after queen takes e3, white plays a good move. Bishop to g4. And then after bishop to g4, it's black that plays another good move. Pawn to h5. And then white retreats the bishop back to h3. And then black moves his pawn to g5. And he wants to play g4 to force white to lose the bishop. And then white moves his knight to d2. And then black moves his pawn to g4. And then after pawn to g4, white moves his knight to c4, which forced the black queen and the black rook. But then black takes the white pawn on g3 with his queen. And then after queen takes g3, white takes the black rook with his knight on b6. And then black takes the white bishop with his pawn on h3. And then that threatens queen takes g2 mate, so white has to be kind of careful. And then after g takes h3, white moves the queen to f3 to defend against the checkmate. And then black takes the white pawn on g2 with his own pawn, which checks the white king. Then white takes the black pawn with his queen to escape the check. Then black takes the white queen with his own queen, which another check. And white's only legal move is to capture the black queen on g2 with his king. But then, this is my favorite move of the whole game. Black plays a brilliant move. C takes b6. Now, what black does with this move is he makes space for his king to penetrate on the queen side without allowing white to reduce the number of pawns with the plan a4, then a5. But if black took the white knight like this, then white could have just played a4 intending this, and that should have been sufficient for white to hold the draw. But anyway, black took with the c pawn. And then white puts his rook onto f1 and attacks the black pawn on f7. And then black defends his pawn on f7 with king to e7. And then after king to e7, white moves his rook to e1 with check. Black plays a good move to escape the check, king to d6. And then white moves his rook back to f1 to put pressure on the f7 pawn again. And then black plays another good move, rook to c8. And then after white takes the pawn on f7 with his rook, black plays another good move for the third time in a row, rook to c7, which does offer a trade of rooks. But white declines that trade and instead plays the rook back to f2. The black played another good move, king to e5, so he's played 4 good moves in a row. Then white plays a mistake, pawn to e4, not e4. Then black infiltrates with his king, with the move, king to d4. And then white pushes his pawn to a5. And then black takes the pawn on d3 with his king. And then after king takes d3, white moves his rook to f3 with check to the king. Then black pushes his king even farther with king to c2. Now look how active the black king is compared to the white king. The white king is only on g2. And the black king is on c2, and the king is like attacking all the pawns. Well, not all of them, but the pawn on b2. And then after king to c2, white moves his pawn out of danger to b4. And then black plays a good move, and the final good move of the game, pawn to b5. But the game's not over yet because white moves his pawn to a6. But black is better because he's better. And then after pawn to a6, black moves his rook to c4 to attack the pawn on b4. Then white moves his rook to f7 to counterattack the pawn on a7. And then after that, black takes the pawn on b4 with his rook. And then white plays rook to b7. Now, if white took the pawn, then black could have played rook to a4, and the black b pawn can move forward, but the white a pawn is going nowhere. So, anyway, after rook takes b4, white moves his rook to b7. Then after rook to b7, black played rook to g4 with check. The white moved his king up to f3, and then black pushed his passed pawn to b4. Then white finally took on a7 with his rook, and then black played pawn to b3, and then black won. And there could follow rook to c7 check, king to b1, rook to c5, and then black could have played a good move, rook to a4. And that is the end of this video. Thank you for watching. Like and subscribe if you like these videos.